Hi, this is Pod Safety UK. I'm Coco Khan.
And I'm Nish Kumar. Coco, I hear you've been ruffling the feathers of some of our favourite Tories. Here is a clip of you talking to Jeremy Hunt on BBC's Laura Kuenssberg on Sunday.
Well, I think I'll probably disagree with Coco.
I expect you would, Jeremy.
Respectfully.
Respectfully disagreeing. Well. Did you have fun?
I wish that I could tell you some story about how, like, in the green room, I really told him how it was, but in the green room, they had free pastries, and I am a new mum, so I just sat in the corner, just eating pastries, looking at the various powerful men coming in and out, thinking, God, you're all so tall. Is that a prerequisite for government? You have to all be 6 foot and wear a navy suit.
Well, let's just take a second to observe the true narrative arc of Coco Khan's life, to find yourself in a situation where on a Sunday morning, you woke up, presumably had some interactions with your newborn child, and then went to do a political discussion show on a Sunday morning, whereas previous iterations of Coco Khan would either have simply not been awake or would not have been to bed from the night before. So let's just observe the grand narrative arc.
Before, those conversations with Jeremy Hunt were in my head, and now they're real. Wow. Live your dreams, kids. Stay in school. Drugs are for mugs, etc.
Well, we'll return to that and possibly the topic of drugs are for mugs later on in the show. But today we'll also be discussing the government's proposed policies on protest with Akiko Hart, the director of human rights charity Liberty.
But now, as we record on Wednesday, Chancellor Rachel Reeves is delivering her very first spending review, laying the groundwork for how much money will be allocated to the various plans the government has on its agenda. Let's hear the Chancellor now.
The plan to match the scale of the housing crisis must include social housing. Neglected for too many decades, but not by this Labour government. And so, led by my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister, we are taking action. I am proud to announce the biggest cash injection into social and affordable housing in 50 years. A new affordable homes programme in which I am investing £39 billion over the next decade.
So look, from a progressive perspective, this is the key announcement in the spending review. £39 billion of funding for affordable homes, which is a really big deal. It's an almost doubling of government spending commitments. And as Rachel Reeves says there, the biggest injection of spending in 50 years on social and affordable homes. So that is something that's worth celebrating, and also worth celebrating the kind of pressure that's been put on the government to announce this kind of a spending position. Just from a side note here, the politics of this is also very interesting because there's been a lot of rumblings about lack of unity in the front bench, and specifically around whether Angela Rayner is trying to position herself as a challenger to Keir Starmer. It was obviously hugely significant that Rachel Reeves very clearly mentioned Rayner, and it felt like a real show of unity, I think, maybe to paper over some of the cracks that might have been emerging over the last few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. You might say this is the Labour Party acting more like the Labour Party. I don't want to get too carried away, but, a unified party and actually spending money on places that we really need it. Housing, I mean, it's the foundation of everything that we need to have a good life in this country. I do think, though, we should take it all with a pinch of salt. According to the new Economics Foundation, even $39 billion is going to fall short of providing the 90,000 social homes that are needed each year if the government's going to meet its own 1.5 million housing target. But there were quite a few good things in this. So it was already announced, but new funding for train networks around the UK. I think we can all agree trains being improved is good. And in some ways, you could say easy because they're so bad.
You're clearing a low bar.
Yeah, exactly.
There's also funding to extend free school meals, which will help lift many children out of poverty. Again, though, it is worth flagging there's still no announcements about a plan to end the two-child benefit cap. That's something that I imagine between now and the full budget in the autumn, there'll be a huge amount of pressure from a lot of different groups associated with that. And I imagine a huge amount of pressure from within the Labour Party, and given some of the comments that someone like Gordon Brown has been making from within the kind of wider Labour movement, there's going to be a huge pressure on the government to do that. No announcement on that as we stand. The biggest winner, perhaps unsurprisingly, of the spending review is the NHS, which Rachel Reeves saved for last in her speech. So overall, an extra £29 billion a year will be spent on the NHS, which is an annual rise of 3% on current levels. There'll be increased budget for NHS technology, so that's going to increase by about 50%, with specifically £10 billion earmarked to bring the NHS into the digital age. Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who has really, since the last general election campaign, been pushing social care, has said that the NHS is in crisis and we support extra investment to help turn it around. But without fixing social care, no amount of funding will solve the problem. And it is worth flagging that the social care increases don't meet that 3% level. So there is still an issue with social care here. But obviously, more money going into the NHS is something that is badly needed by the service.
There were, however, some questionable announcements. So one that stands out was the end of asylum hotels. Of course, asylum hotels has been a massive expenditure for the Exchequer, but we know that asylum hotels have been right at the centre of culture war issues. It's a very sensitive topic. Where are the asylum seekers going to go?
Yes. So the announcement is that by the end of this parliament, there will be no more spending on hotel accommodation for asylum seekers. There's some elements of this spending review that are designed to continue to play the game that the Labour Party has tried to play for the last nearly a year in government, which is attempting to keep progressives on side with announcements around social housing and healthcare, but also trying to balance that by offering some red meat to the right of British politics. Kate Duffy Saidi, the co-artistic director of Phosphorus Theatre, who works with refugees, welcomed the plan as, and this is the quote, a long overdue recognition of the need for dignity and stability. But that said, without safe routes, timely and fair decision-making, and the right to work, those seeking asylum will continue to face harm, uncertainty, and exclusion. And that is the key point here. Unless we reform the asylum system and provide safe and legal routes, and also give people seeking asylum in this country the ability to work, which we cannot state often enough, they do not have the ability to do, nothing is going to change. And we're still going to be stuck in a kind of limbo position.
But anyway, moving on. So Reeves also talked about new investment in nuclear power. So they spoke about new funding for small modular nuclear reactors, which are to be built by Rolls-Royce. It's essentially small versions of old school nuclear plants.
She also announced more money for carbon capture technology. Now, that is a technology that various environmental scientists and experts have raised serious questions about in terms of its actual efficiency. There was a lot of tough on crime rhetoric, so there'll be an increase of police spending power by 2.3% per year. I guess the idea is to put more police onto the streets. There'll also be £7 billion invested into creating new prison places. Now, we've talked about this on the show. We have an enormous problem with prison capacity. Whether creating more prison space is the solution for that. Again, it feels like the stress is on something that's going to look good in the Daily Mail and pass the kind of Daily Mail test, rather than looking at the justice system from a holistic perspective and asking, is it necessary that we have this many people in prison? Is this actually productive for British society? But anyway, throughout these announcements, Reeves was attempting to send a very clear message to the public.
I am determined to do everything in my power to put more money in people's pockets, to give people security and control in their lives, to make working people better off, and to show them that this government, this Labour government, is on their side.
So, this is the fundamental political question. Can this start to turn the tide of public opinion? Because polling right now is absolutely dire, especially for Rachel Reeves. According to YouGov at the moment, just 11% of people polled think she's doing a good job as Chancellor, which is even worse than the low point of Jeremy Hunt's tenure as Chancellor, which was 13%.
So another point of comparison here, Rishi Sunak's worst result as Chancellor was a 22% approval rate. And at the height of his popularity, so during coronavirus, of course, the public loved him, he enjoyed a 53% approval rating. That's a pretty high watermark. I mean, Reeves's best result is only 20%.
And in terms of voter sentiment, some research done by More in Common said that when asking people who they think the government is prioritising, most would still say it's the wealthy. and perhaps the most damning stat from their research is just a tenth of Britons think that Labour's economic plans are in line with what they promised in the election campaign. But Coco, do you think this is the start of them being able to turn those polling numbers around?
I mean, I really hope so. I mean, we've talked about it on this podcast a lot. You know, we need to change the material conditions of people's lives in the UK. And a lot of what Labour have tended to do is kind of tinker around the edges. And maybe it sounds good to wonks, but, you know, do real people feel these 1%, 2% uplifts? I'm not convinced they do. I do have some questions after this spending review, though. So they didn't talk about the 2-child benefit cap. But when they have spoken about it in the past, they keep saying this thing, which is that we will do it, we will lift this cap when essentially when the numbers add up, when the economic conditions allow us to. You know, lots of ambitious things were announced today. Does that mean our economic conditions have improved? And also, I did notice that the Conservatives piped up in opposition to say, oh, you know, you're doing all this stuff. There's no way you're going to be able to pay for it. You're going to lift taxes a little bit later. If that is the case, I really hope it's a wealth tax we're looking at. That's very important to me, that certain people pay their way rather than everyone else is obviously feeling the pinch.
Yes, that was the main focus of the Conservative opposition. And the National Institute of Economic and Social Research has said the Chancellor may be forced to raise taxes at the next fiscal event. And that's probably also tips to the most important thing here, which is this is a spring spending statement. It's where the money's going to go, but it's not actually fully telling us where the money has come from. This may just be because I have quite recently seen the last 2 Mission Impossible films, but there is an element of the spring statement being Dead Reckoning Part 1 and the autumn budget being the final reckoning.
These need explaining.
Basically splitting one film into 2 parts. It's what they've done with the last Spider-Verse cartoon. There's an element to which we get to the end of something like this, the spring statement, and you go, okay, but we really still don't know how Tom Cruise is going to deal with the entity. And in this case, Tom Cruise is Rachel Reeves. They're both people with a odd, stilted, and very specific charisma. And the entity in this case is Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules, because this is only a plan of how the government is going to spend its money, but it doesn't fully give us a story of where the money's going to come from. So this idea of tax rises being almost inevitable is a can that's been kicked down the road, essentially. We're only going to hear about that when we go into the autumn. The other really important thing to note is that Rachel Reeves was very quick to slam the Conservative government's economic record and was almost as quick to launch an attack on Nigel Farage's spending plans. Reeves was claiming that Farage would create another economic black hole, much like the one Liz trusted. But what that tells you, most importantly, is, as we've said over the last few weeks, Labour identify that the biggest political threat to it is coming from reform. Or at the very, very least, they identify the political threat is coming equally from Reform and the Conservative Party, which is sort of an extraordinary situation, especially given, as we'll talk about later in the show, the chaos that Reform is engulfed in on a permanent week-to-week basis.
So, look, we've gone over a lot of stuff here in not much detail, but stay tuned over the coming weeks where we'll be following up on many of these announcements. And we want to know what you, dear listeners, thought. So, yeah, drop us an email at psuk@reducelistening.co.uk.
Now, coming up after the break, we'll be finding out how to protect the right to protest with Akiko Hart, the director of the human rights organisation Liberty.
Pod Save the UK is brought to you by Shopify.
Listen, we all do a chunk of our shopping online, and that chunk is getting bigger and bigger and bigger by the second. If you've ever bought anything online, you will have noticed the Shop Pay button. That's in purple and makes it easy to buy something online. Well, that purple button is a telltale sign that the store is powered by Shopify. Shopify doesn't just make it easy to buy, it makes it incredibly easy to start a business, no matter how much experience you have. And there is a reason that that purple Shopify button is everywhere these days.
Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started.
Shopify gives you the leg up from day dot with hundreds of beautiful, ready-to-go templates to express your brand style and forget about all the coding.
Tackle all those important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more.
Spread your brand's word with built-in marketing and email tools to find and keep new customers.
And did we mention that iconic purple Shop Pay button? It's used by millions of businesses around the world. It's why Shopify has the best converting checkout on the planet. Your customers already love it.
If you want to see less carts being abandoned, it's time for you to head over to Shopify.
Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.co.uk/podsavethuk.
Go to shopify.co.uk/podsavethuk.
Shopify.co.uk/podsavethuk.
Now, protest is one of the most important ways that we as citizens can make our voices heard. Enshrined within the European Convention on Human Rights, protest is protected, but proposed interventions from across the political spectrum are setting off alarm bells.
The government's upcoming crime and policing bill seeks to introduce new measures that would restrict the ability for protesters to mask their faces, which, if that sounds familiar, is almost exactly what Rishi Sunak's government proposed to do.
As we've seen in LA over the last week, masks have been a critical protection for the identity of people protesting the US government's mass deportations, as President Trump sends in the National Guard and deploys Marines to shut down demonstrations. So what's at stake here, and how can we fight to protect our rights?
Joining us now is Akiko Hart, the Director of Liberty, the organisation campaigning to protect human rights in the UK. Nice to see you, Akiko.
Lovely to see you both, and thank you so much for having me.
Akiko, just to kick things off, what was your reaction, your sort of initial reaction to the clashes between the government and protesters that we've seen happening on the streets of Los Angeles in the last week?
I think, like many people, I watched that footage with huge dismay and concern. And for me, it's a story about protest for sure, but it's also a story about how protest is weaponized by authoritarian governments. So, what we've seen around the world, including the UK, is a crackdown on protests, anti-protest legislation coming in, and that space around protests becoming much more narrow. What we're seeing in America and what we've seen in other countries is how an authoritarian government can essentially weaponize that by escalating things, by creating a very kind of like anti-protester narrative, by bringing in the military and essentially creating the conditions for a breakdown in kind of democratic kind of institutions and that separation of powers. And we're seeing that happening in real time. And even though that's not where we are in the UK, we absolutely have one of those preconditions for that, which is this crackdown on protest.
So Trump issued an order to arrest people in face masks. What is the story with masks and protests in the UK?
So there's currently a bill going through Parliament called the Crime and Policing Bill. It's called a Christmas tree bill because there's so many different elements to it. And some of the amendments in this bill are around protest, which is extremely disappointing because actually in the last few years, we've lived through two big pieces of anti-protest legislation, the Policing Act and then the Public Order Act. So specifically in this Crime and Policing Bill, there is an amendment around banning masks in protests. So the situation we have at the moment is that the police can ask you to remove your mask during a protest. So that's already in place. Those powers are already in place. What this would do is stop, for example, disabled people from wearing masks in protests and therefore being able to participate in protests, or force political dissidents who may want to mask up to, protect their identity and the security of their families, to stop them from being able to wear masks at protests. So it's a really, really consequential amendment and, part of a raft of anti-protest measures that we've seen.
I basically wanted to seek clarification from you that it is still, at this moment in time, okay to wear masks, because I have worn masks to many protests. I think when I first started doing it was for COVID reasons, it's a mass gathering, you had to be safe. And then shortly after that, I started to notice that other like-minded journalists like myself, who, have been engaged in political issues, were getting essentially set upon online, or if not even online, sometimes even in the actual papers, right-wing papers. If they were famous enough, then the right-wing paper would run a piece about like XYZ journalist spotted at this protest or whatever. And after that, it just became amongst some of my journalist friends like a convention. You just wear a face mask. That would be the right and appropriate thing to do. And it's funny because I remember having a conversation with someone at one of the Palestine protests where I'd taken a photo of their brilliant sign that they had. and they wanted to appear next to the photo. And I said, oh, do you want to appear next to the photo? Maybe put a face mask on. And we had this conversation. It was quite strange because the person I was speaking to was like, I'm really proud of my opinions. Aren't you proud of your opinions? And I was like, I am proud. Of course I am. But protesting, it should be as common in our democracy as like voting. It shouldn't be such a high stakes thing where your life can be ruined for participating. And so I have this like weird philosophical conversation with a woman there saying like, look, I'm here because I want to be counted. I want people to know that this is a mass turnout, but I don't want to risk my entire life, my livelihood. And it was a strange conversation where I think sometimes people think, well, you know, if you have conviction, you should allow your life to be ruined for this conviction. And I really disagree with that. I think that this should be a standard part of our democracy and it shouldn't be so fraught.
I completely agree. And I think, you know, from my perspective, protest is a part of democratic voice, right? So you don't just kind of exercise your democratic voice every 5 years at the ballot box. You do so in loads of different ways. Protest is one of them. And if you think about any of the rights that we enjoy now, like whether it's, you know, right for women to vote or the right to a weekend, all of those rights, in fact, partly came through via protest. Protest wasn't the only mechanism that enabled it to happen, but it was one of them. And I think we kind of forget that because essentially what is happening now is that protest has entered the kind of culture wars sphere, you know, and that makes it much, much harder and far less safe, as you say, to protest.
So I do also want to talk to you about the actions of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission following on from the Supreme Court's ruling on the definition of a woman earlier this year. Your organisation, so Liberty, has been working to challenge the way that organisation consulted on the changes to its code of practice. They initially only ordered a 2-week consultation, right? You know, what's happening there and why was it so important for you to challenge it?
So the Supreme Court judgment was on the definition of man, woman and sex in relation to the Equality Act. So the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the EHRC, which is essentially the equalities watchdog in England and Wales, then issued an update to its code of practice and put it out to consultation. You're right, they initially set it at 2 weeks and then they extended it to 6 weeks. And Liberty is taking the EHRC, the Equalities Watchdog, to court because we believe that 6 weeks is not a lawful period for consultation. It should be 12 weeks. So why are we doing this? We're doing this because this guidance touches on really, really complex issues and it's really consequential. So it's complex because this is actually a really, really difficult area of law. So before the Supreme Court judgments, it was lawful for a single-sex service provider to lawfully exclude trans women if they chose to do so. So the question after the Supreme Court judgment is, do all single-sex services or providers have to exclude trans women? And you've got some people like Lord Sumption and Baroness Hill, who are former Supreme Court judges, who are saying or seem to be suggesting that that's not their understanding, that service providers don't have to do that. And then you've got the watchdog in their guidance who seem to be suggesting that, yes, you do have to do that. You do have to exclude trans women if you're a single-sex service provider. So there's huge legal disagreement about the actual practical implications of this judgment. And it's really, really consequential. It's really consequential if you're a business. It's really consequential if you're a service provider. And of course, it's really consequential if you are trans or if you don't conform to gender norms, because it will affect how you can access public spaces and employment and services. So it feels vitally important that we allow all of these different stakeholders the opportunity to get the legal advice they need to get, to read these 50 pages of updates on this incredibly complex piece of law, and to be able to participate in this consultation properly.
And so what's the next stage for that? Are you issuing legal challenges to the EHRC? How does that actually manifest itself?
So we are in the early stages of a legal challenge. So we're waiting for permission to kind of continue essentially this week. And then it will be kind of heard in court. And that should happen in the next 2 weeks, 10 days or so.
So you mentioned cultural wars earlier. So I do want to talk to you a little bit about let's just call it bluster from politicians on we'll call them populist right. I'm trying to choose my words correctly. That they're calling for an exit from the European Convention on Human Rights. One of the bits of our membership of the EU that we got to keep after Brexit was this European Convention on Human Rights. Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch has launched a review into a possible exit. Nigel Farage has declared that if he were to ever become PM, aside from me and Nish leaving, one of the first things he would do would be to enact leaving this convention. He claims that 3/4 of the country would cheer it on. I mean, I don't know. So what's at risk here, and why are they so obsessed with this particular convention?
It's so interesting, isn't it? Why are they so obsessed? So just to take a couple of steps back, what is this convention? So the European Convention on Human Rights, it's the 75th anniversary this year, and it's a treaty on human rights that was set up after World War II. And that's really important. It was essentially kind of agreed after the Holocaust, after the Nuremberg trials, to agree a series of kind of like principles about all of our rights and freedoms. So that's what that is. And linked to that, you've got the European Court on Human Rights, which adjudicates some of these decisions. And that's in Strasbourg. So that often comes up when people are talking about this. And you've also got, confusingly, the Council of Europe, which is the body that kind of oversees all of this. And this is confusing because it is not the European Union and it is not the European Council either. So generally, when people are talking about withdrawing from the European Convention, they're talking about withdrawing from all three of these things. So what's really, really interesting about this is that there's always been an argument to withdraw from the European Convention, but it has always been, until about 10 years ago, a really, really fringe argument. But what's happened in the last 10 years is that the European Convention has been conflated with migration. And that's essentially the pitch here. And so the pitch to voters is, if you want to stop the boats, if you want to control our borders, we're going to have to leave the European Convention. And I want to be really, really clear about this. This is not factually correct. We could leave, we could withdraw from the European Convention and would absolutely not have that effect on migration. So the kind of effect that it would have is, for example, at the moment, we don't deport foreign national offenders back to countries where they will be tortured. Okay? So we would be able to do that, but we wouldn't be able to, stop the boats or control migration. And so essentially, it's a vehicle that's being used in this way, and that suits the purposes, I think, of a small bunch of people who've always believed that we should leave it. And what happens if we leave it? We jeopardize the Good Friday Agreement, because the European Convention is completely embedded in this, and therefore, peace in Northern Ireland. It forms the basis of our trade and cooperation agreements with the EU. So all of that kind of like suddenly is up for grabs, and we'd be withdrawing from, a post-World War II international consensus on human rights and freedoms. So that's what would actually happen.
Well, that's the way that authoritarian governments always go about it, right? They say, oh, we need to clamp down on, enter, scary thing here, terrorism, I don't know, whatever it might be. And so the public gives their consent to basically give up some of their rights. And then next thing you know, they're turning on the citizens, right? I mean, we're seeing it right now in LA, right? Literally the military are being used to control the people. This is what happens.
Yeah, that's right. And the one thing I would urge everyone to do is to kind of look at this playbook, because it's not just in America, it's all around the world. It is in Argentina, it's in Brazil, in Hungary. You crack down on protests, you go for kind of trans rights, you go for migrants' rights, you go for all of these wedge issues, and then more and more and more. We cannot assume that we are going to be safe in the UK.
Sometimes I wonder, and I don't know if this is me being too simplistic, whether it's just the fact that it says European in the European Convention of Human Rights. What if it was rebranded to Great British Human Rights? Do you think that would help? Is this just an issue of marketing about this living instrument? I mean, it sounds great. Maybe we just need to sell it again.
It's really interesting, that one. So what Reform and some of the Conservatives are proposing is that we withdraw from the European Convention, and essentially we get rid of the Human Rights Act and we create a new British Bill of Rights. So they're already ahead of you. They're already doing this. And the question for people is, do people really think that this new British Bill of Rights will give us as many or more rights than we already have? That is the question. I would have thought not.
It's good to see that they also get their ideas from just watching British Bake Off, British Sewing Bee, just all BBC franchises. They're like, yes, let's do this in politics.
Akiko, Liberty's had some success in fighting back against the government for our rights to protest in the last couple of years, haven't you? I think it's always worth, whenever we have these conversations where it feels like we just constantly going, oh my God, everything is either fucked or well down the road to being thoroughly fucked. It's worth celebrating the fact that Liberty in the last couple of years has actually managed to score some really significant wins, right?
We have. And I'm going to come back to that point about hope, actually. But yes, we did. We had a really, really big win recently, which I'm so happy about. So in all of this kind of wider context around the crackdown on protest, we won a big victory on protest. So under the previous government, the then Home Secretary Suella Braverman introduced a law around protest, which changed the point at which the police could intervene in a protest. So instead of it being serious disruption, it was anything that was more than minor. She changed that definition. She pushed it through Parliament, despite it being rejected by Parliament. And 2 courts and 5 judges have agreed that that was unlawful, and the government are no longer appealing. That law has been quashed. It is a significant victory in this kind of fight for our rights. So I'm delighted.
So let's talk about hope then, Akiko. What's making you hopeful in this kind of fight for our protests? I mean, it's got to be inspiring to see the sheer numbers of people turning out in spite of this crackdown, whether it's in the streets in LA or here in the UK on Gaza protests. I mean, that's certainly something that makes me feel very hopeful.
Yeah, I agree. 100%. We have to hold on to the hope, and we have to nurture the hope, because part of what is happening here, I think, is that we can all look at what is happening around the world and go, there's no point in fighting this because it's just going to happen here. But this is an opportunity to speak up, however we do that, whether that's through going on protests, whether that's through your journalism, whether that's through your art, through your work, through conversations with your friends, through your kind of mutual aid or peer support group in your community. Because I think now is the opportunity for us to say, this is the future that we want. So not just a defensive, we're trying to defend what we already have, but this is the world that we want to see. And we need to articulate it. And this is the time to do it. And we need to do that in the face of all of these threats, because the only way that we're going to defeat these threats is that if we articulate what we want and we bring people with us.
I think that's the perfect place to leave this. Akiko Hart, thank you so much for joining us on Pod Save the UK.
Thank you so much.
And now a quick but significant update on the UK's position on the Gaza war. On Tuesday, the UK announced new sanctions on 2 Israeli ministers, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, declaring that they have incited violence against the Palestinian people. It's a significant development as the UK changes its tone on the ongoing genocide.
In response, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has rebuked the UK, saying, "We remind our partners not to forget who the real enemy is. The United States urges the reversal of the sanctions and stands shoulder to shoulder with Israel."
Look, this is another long overdue and positive step in the UK correcting our language. And it's important to note that this has been in no small part due to the strength of protest across our country, letting our politicians know that we care. Greta Thunberg's aid flotilla over the last week, which of course was intercepted by the Israeli government before they made landfall in Gaza, is another example of protest really making an impact. And of course, for more on the absurd response to the protests in Los Angeles, we really, as ever, encourage you to tune in to Pod Save America, where you'll find a fantastic interview with the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, where he discusses Trump's wild suggestion that he could be arrested.
Now, after the break, Reform UK is in meltdown and their chairman, Zia Yusuf, performs the political equivalent of the Hokey Cokey. Is he in or is he out? So I just need to take a moment because this is a delightful thing to read. It gives me great pleasure to say that Reform UK seems to be in meltdown.
Yes, what a week. The party chairman, Zia Yusuf, resigned last Thursday after saying it was dumb, that's a direct quote, of the party's newest MP, Sarah Pochin, to ask the Prime Minister if he would ban the burqa at PMQs. Upon resigning, Yusuf said, "I no longer believe working to get a reform government elected is a good use of my time." Any time spent on Reform UK is not a good use of your time. You absolute magic bean buying moron. But in less than 48 hours, he was back in the reform fold. Don't call it a comeback. He returned to the party and in the process of doing that, delivered an absolute word salad about his change of heart to the BBC's Nick Robinson.
The question was asked in the House of Commons by Sarah, who's a brilliant MP, and then it was also made clear that that would not be party policy. So that's all I was stating. I was reflecting the party's position.
So it was dumb to say it rather than to call for it, is that what you're saying?
Correct, yeah. So I learnt about this, and this is, to some degree, I made this a bit of a storm in a teacup because, again, I was exhausted. But I learnt about all of that: A, the question, and then B, the fact that it wasn't policy on my X feed. And look, that's perfectly reasonable because I'm not an MP. So, ultimately, as I said, I regret that tweet.
My goodness.
I mean, that guy must have had some bad word food because he's got a serious case of verbal diarrhea.
I mean, people have been describing it as a kind of whiplash, but I confess, as a spectator, I kind of got a little bit of whiplash myself. When I first heard the story, and I would only describe it as a small amount of sympathy, but I definitely had a flash of it. All the reportage was saying that he got racially abused, and it was actually him who tried to crack down on the real cranks, the real Nazis being in the party. Obviously, my opinion is that was a task that was never going to be fully achieved, but nonetheless. And so there was a part of me that was like, look, I don't agree with this man, but I don't want anyone to be hate crimed. And, I kind of felt a little bit of sympathy for him. And it appeared to me that he took a stand over this burqa ban question. And then it turns out that actually, no, he does agree. He's actually been quoted as saying if there was a vote on a burqa ban, he'd probably vote for it. But he was annoyed that it was asked. I was like, oh no, why did I waste my sympathy, my precious sympathy that I could have given to someone, literally anyone else?
We've lived in the UK through this kind of period of very high profile people of colour, particularly a lot of South Asians achieving political prominence in the Conservative Party or Reform or UKIP. And look, we've talked about it a lot on this show and the sort of legacy of Rishi Sunak as the first person of colour to be Prime Minister of this country. There is often a moment when the Conservative person of colour finds themselves completely abandoned by their political party. And there is often a genuinely lonely moment for those people. I remember watching the 2019 Conservative leadership hustings because I hate myself. But I remember watching that, and I remember watching all of the assembled people on that panel refuse to in any way speak supportively as Sajid Javid, who was also on that panel, given that he had been excluded from an invitation at the official state dinner conducted when Donald Trump was visiting the United Kingdom. Sajid Javid was a member of cabinet. It was unorthodox that he wasn't invited. And I watched him in real time essentially be abandoned by the people that he thinks of as his colleagues and potentially even friends. I watched Rishi Sunak be interviewed where he had to digest this idea that a person who was working for the Reform Party in a Channel 4 documentary said that they were a Conservative voter, but they could no longer vote for Rishi Sunak, and then called him a racial slur. And there is often a moment where these Conservatives of colour realise the contempt by which they are held by people within their own political movements. And that is something that I think you can have empathy for, but there isn't a sufficient reaction against it from these powerful people of colour. Zia Yusuf was in a position where he could have walked away from reform and said that this saber rattling against the burqa, which, beyond just being an act of wanton racism and Islamophobia, also on top of that, does nothing to address the myriad very real problems faced by the people of this country. There could have been a decisive moment in the sand where he walked away from that and said, look, that, the party is racist and toxic. We don't want to align ourselves with that. But once again, he's kowtowed to, if I can borrow David Cameron's old term for the hard right of British politics, loonies, fruitcakes and closet racists. He's kowtowed to them once again. What message have we been sending our young people of colour in the last decade and a half in British politics? The message we have sent them is, if you are the victim of racist abuse, you just have to take it on the chin. And as long as you want to participate in these broad political movements, I'm so glad that I grew up in an era of, Asian Dub Foundation and
Goodness gracious me.
Yeah, I'm so glad that my role models were people who spoke out against this instead of kowtowing to it. And, on top of all of this other stuff, what we really, really need to stress here is this shows that Reform is not a proper political party. They are not organised. They are not capable of any kind of basic message discipline. And if they can't organise that, how on earth do you expect them to run a government if that is what people are proposing happens at the next election?
If there are any young Reform voters or members listening to this podcast who also happen to be people of colour, let us tell you, as your auntie and uncle, you can convince yourself that these people will overlook the colour of your skin because of your shared beliefs in whatever it might be, low taxation or whatever. Maybe you have your own reservations about migration. You're entitled to your opinions. Being a person of colour, we don't all have the same opinions. That's all absolutely fine. But they won't overlook it. It will come and bite you in the butt. I'm just letting you know that will happen. Okay, so just bear that in mind. I think it's also worth saying that even though Yusuf has explained that this was all just a misunderstanding, he hasn't actually stepped back into the role. He has been replaced by David Bull, who's used to be on telly, it turns out.
Listen, we all used to be on telly, okay?
No, but you were great on telly. This guy, I kid you not, appeared live on Talk TV wearing a bandage on his ear as an homage to President Trump. Oh my God, it's so sad. It's so sad.
There have been allegations even within the wider leftist movement of progressive politicians engaging in gesture politics, but there has never been a more stupid piece of gesture politics than wearing a bandage on your ear.
Reform always acts like they're patriots, but they're just in awe and obsessed with America, in particular Trump's America. Get some of your own ideas. It's actually pathetic. So Yusuf, for his part in Reform, he's now set to lead what the party's calling its Doge team, based on the Department of Government Efficiency set up in the US by Trump. And of course, Elon Musk. Get some new ideas. You're obsessed. You're actually obsessed. It's quite pathetic.
Even the infighting feels like it's been ripped off from Elon Musk and Donald Trump.
Yeah, I know. But like a Poundland version, like a shit British version. Oh, no.
Well, look, with Reform UK dealing with dramatic exits and awkward returns, we might be forgiven for forgetting that Elon Musk and Donald Trump, as I say, have been having their own extremely public feud.
Yeah, so Musk is claiming that Trump is in the Epstein files. Trump called Musk a big-time drug addict. You can see where this is going.
Tell us something we don't know, lads. Is Donald Trump's comb-over ineffective? Does Elon Musk look like his skin doesn't fit over his own body? These are all things we know.
You can catch all the juiciest bits of this fallout, though, on Pod Save America. So hosts and former Obama aides John Favreau, John Lovett and Tommy Vietor dig into the tech bro meltdown, the political stakes and what it reveals about the American right.
For the US version of this week's political chaos, check out Pod Save America. New episodes drop twice a week wherever you get your podcasts. So look, as we mentioned at the top of the show, over the weekend, Coco was on Laura Kuenssberg's BBC Sunday morning political talk show with some unsavoury characters. Perhaps the worst of the lot was Richard Tice, who rocked up to tell us all just how much he detests net zero policies.
We're the only people talking about how the Bank of England should stop wasting tens of billions of pounds. We're the only people saying you should scrap net stupid zero, and that would save 20 to 30 billion pounds a year. And we're the only people saying, actually, we should stop wasting taxpayers' cash.
Listen, it's worth briefly noting here that sometimes when you're the only person saying something, it's because you are defying the winds of history and trying to imagine a better tomorrow. But sometimes you're the only person saying something because you're wrong and a moron. It's not fully enough to be the only person saying something. Also, you're not the only person saying something. You're not a plucky band of rebels who are trying to push against the consensus. You're just parroting oil company talking points, okay? Tice is one of the UK's most prominent climate change deniers, and here is a little reminder of some of his views.
It's Tice's take on the climate debate. CO2. People make out that it's some form of poison. It's not. It's plant food. It's responsible for photosynthesis, without which we get no plants, no food, we all die. You've got to challenge the mainstream narrative on this. Oh, and by the way, do you know how much CO2 is in the atmosphere? Is it 10%, 20%, 5%? No, it's 0.04 of 1%. That's like one limb on one person in Wembley Stadium of 100,000 people. It's only just above a record multi-million year low. It's not a problem. Stop worrying. Stop being scared.
Wow.
What the
I've never
fuck
seen
did
that
I just
before.
watch? I feel like I've got stupider watching that fucking shit.
I can't believe that's real. The Alan Partridge energy of him was huge. And I'd probably laugh at it if it wasn't so scary.
He's talking absolute nonsense.
He really is.
The production values on that thing were no good. I will say that. I also just don't think if you want your points on science to be taken seriously, they should involve a penny whistle. Like, I don't think at any point this noise should ever accompany a serious discussion of science.
Also, his argument is basically CO2 is natural, so therefore it's safe. Loads of things are unsafe that are cyanide is from plants, Richard Tice. There are many things that are produced naturally that could kill you.
That's right. The woke left wants you to think that cyanide is a problem, but I chew down at least 10 grams of it with my cereal every morning. Cyanide's from plants. The woke left trying to say plants are illegal? If you eat cyanide, you will die, but you are one person out of 100,000 at Wembley Stadium. So what does it matter? Anyway, listen, it's really always worth remembering every time that you ever hear Richard Tice say anything about the climate or the climate crisis or net stupid zero for poo-poo bum-bum heads or whatever he's going to call it, it's always worth remembering one key figure, and that is that since the last election, Reform has accepted £2.3 million from fossil fuel interests, climate change deniers and polluters. And another number that's worth bearing in mind is that amounts to 92% of the party's donations. So Reform has accepted 2.3 million, which is 92% of the party's donations from fossil fuel interests. Those are the only figures that matter when it comes to Tice's take on the net zero. But Coco, let's talk a little bit more about Koonsberg on Sunday. You had some policy ideas of your own. Here is you making your pitch for one of your favourite topics, tax, and also folding in one of your other favourite topics, bins.
Tax is cool. I feel we need a rebrand of tax. Tax is a good thing. It's the only vehicle we have to stop the ultra rich taking complete advantage of us. And also, my bins only get collected every 2 weeks. I'm very sad about it. I would pay more tax. I like to see more people be proud of tax.
Okay. I'm glad you're not standing for Parliament, Coco, because I don't think that line would go down very well.
Tax is cool. Coming to a leaflet news.
Tax is cool.
Tax is cool. No, but on a serious note, it was weird being in the studio because you had there was a Labour minister in there, and there was a sense of a political consensus that tax is a bad thing and the aim is to bring it down. The way all the questions, all the conversation was about well, your tax burden was very high. Well, no, your tax burden was very high. And, you had politicians on the back foot trying to justify it. And I just felt that if you were watching that, you would honestly believe that everyone in Britain wants a small state and wants low taxation. Everyone in Britain wants us to be Singapore or something. And I just sort of felt no, that's not true. There's lots of us in Britain who don't want that. So just strong-arming my stupid opinions at the earliest possible moment, which I believe is what all politicians do. So, I saw an opening, Nish, and I went in there with tax is cool, and I like my bins collected more. That just, you got to take advantage while you can.
I can't believe you got to bins so quickly. That's
It's quite impressive, isn't it?
Yeah, the conversation was around taxation. Nobody had mentioned bins.
Yeah, I know. I am a broken record when it comes to bins. But if you want to hear more about why tax is cool, come and see our live show at Crossed Wires Festival in Sheffield on Sunday the 6th of July with former trader and campaigner against inequality, Gary Stevenson.
Tickets are on sale now. There's a link in our show notes and we hope to see you there.
And that's it. Thanks for listening to Pod Save the UK. Don't forget to follow at Pod Save the UK on Instagram, TikTok and Twitter, and on Blue Sky at podsavetheuk.crooked.com. And if you want more of us, make sure you've subscribed to our YouTube channel.
Pod Save the UK is a reduced listening production for Crooked Media.
Thanks to senior producer James Tyndale and producer May Robson.
Our theme music is by Vasilis Fotopoulos.
The executive producers are Anishka Sharma and Katie Long, with additional support from Ari Schwartz.
And remember to hit subscribe for new shows on Thursdays on Amazon, Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, Tice's take on bees. They're natural. They can't hurt you. By all means, stick your genitals into a beehive today. Don't let the woke left spoil your fun of rubbing your genitals in a sweet, sweet beehive. Tice's take.